The dropship didn't bother to land. It screamed through the atmosphere, a burning comet of twisted titanium, tearing a massive trench through the rock of Obsidian Gorge. The impact shook the very foundation of Ethelgard. Metal shrieked and crumpled, instantly vaporizing the Xyloc horde's vanguard and violently severing them from the retreating royal guard. Out of the smoldering wreckage, 44 humans stepped into the choking dust, drawing a line in the dirt against an endless swarm of alien terrors. At their center stood Captain Elias Vance. He spat a mouthful of blood, thumbed the safety off his rifle, and tossed a tarnished old earth coin into the ash. High above the gorge, standing on the crumbling balconies of the citadel, Crown Princess Lyra fell to her knees. Her hands trembled violently against the cold stone. For 6 cycles, the Xyloc had relentlessly bombarded her world. Her military was entirely broken. The surrender broadcast was already queued on her datapad. She had fully prepared to give herself over to the swarm to spare what was left of her people. Then the sky had torn open. Truth is, the survival of a dying empire didn't come down to superior fleet tactics or ancient prophecies. It came down to a childhood promise forged in a desolate refugee camp. To save a cornered princess, a human captain brought the deadliest weapon in the galaxy: pure, unadulterated stubbornness. 20 years earlier, Cryon Station had been a dumping ground for the displaced. Lyra wasn't a crowned princess in those days, just a terrified, hollow-eyed child hiding in the ventilation shafts after the first Xyloc incursions. She was freezing. Her ribs ached from constant hunger. The station's security forces routinely stepped right over her, but Elias hadn't. He was just a low-ranking deckhand back then, his face smeared with engine grease, boots scuffed and worn down at the heels. He didn't see political leverage. He just saw a kid who was hurting. He had knelt beside her, sliding a foil-wrapped ration pack across the metal grating. It was just stale protein bread and some heavily synthesized fruit, but it was the first kind thing anyone had done for her in months. Before his ship departed the sector, he pressed a heavy, unfamiliar metal disc into her palm, a coin from his homeworld. "Keep it safe," he had told her, his smile easy and warm. "If you ever find yourself in a tight spot, you just cash that in. I'll come running." A simple act of sharing food, a moment of treating a broken child with dignity. Neither of them knew it would fundamentally alter the geopolitical map of the quadrant 2 decades later. Down in the gorge, the roar of the Xyloc horde was deafening. 10,000 chitinous, many-limbed horrors surged forward, their mandibles clicking in eager anticipation of the slaughter. But Elias and his 43 Marines didn't flinch. They had deliberately chosen this exact spot. It was a brutal, narrow bottleneck. The horde's overwhelming numbers were suddenly entirely useless here, their rigid command structure completely disrupted by the sheer geographic squeeze and the highly adaptable, chaotic violence of human infantry. Elias felt the intense heat of his rifle barrel radiating through his reinforced gloves. The muscles in his legs burned from the crash. Sweat stung his eyes behind a cracked visor. He glanced back over his shoulder, looking up the sheer cliff face toward the citadel. He couldn't see her through the thick smoke, but he felt the weight of her gaze. He keyed his comms. The channel crackled with static and the heavy, ragged breathing of 43 men and women who knew exactly what they were about to do. "Hold the line," Elias growled, planting his boots firmly in the blasted soil. "Make them pay for every inch." The first wave hit like a physical wall of screeching hunger and clicking blades. Elias didn't think, he simply became a machine of kinetic energy. The rifle kicked against his bruised shoulder with a rhythmic, punishing thud. Beside him, a Marine went down, her chest plate torn open like wet paper. There was no time to mourn. There was only the bottleneck. The Xylocs surged forward, their multiple limbs scuttling over the mounting piles of their own dead, but they couldn't bring their numbers to bear. In the narrow throat of Obsidian Gorge, 44 humans made 10,000 monsters fight them one at a time. Ironically, the Xyloc commanders couldn't fathom it. Their collective intelligence operated on rigid logic and overwhelming force. When a force is outmatched 1,000 to 1, it surrenders or dies quickly. It does not dig in. It does not laugh through shattered teeth. It certainly does not shout ancient, defiant war cries from a dead language on a distant planet. Elias felt a sharp, burning agony flare in his side. A Xylok's serrated limb had found a gap in his plating. He didn't fall. He leaned into the wound, using the weight of the creature to pin it against the rock before putting a round through its skull. His vision began to swim, the edges of the gorge blurring into a murky gray. He could hear the sound of his own blood pumping in his ears, a frantic, wet drumbeat. Behind him, the remaining 30 Marines were forming a tighter circle. They were out of ammunition. They were down to combat blades and the heavy, blunt ends of their rifles. "Hold!" Elias screamed, his voice raw from the smoke and the screaming. "Give her the time." High above, Lyra watched the slaughter through a long-range scope. She saw the way the humans moved, not like a desperate rabid animal, but with a cold, calculated ferocity. They weren't just fighting for her. They were breaking the Xylok's momentum by sheer force of personality. She saw Elias stagger. She saw him pull a detonator from his belt. In fact, she realized in that moment that he had never intended to survive the day. The ship's reactor hadn't just crashed, it had been rigged. Elias looked up one last time. He couldn't see the princess, but he looked exactly where he knew she would be. He felt the cold weight of the void pressing in on his lungs. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and the metallic tang of blood. He had lived a hard life, mostly in the dark corners of the galaxy, but this felt like the first time he was truly standing in the light. He keyed the wide-range broadcast, his voice surprisingly steady. "Molan Labe," he whispered. "Come and take them." The explosion didn't just collapse the gorge, it vaporized the entire Xylok forward command. The mountain itself seemed to fold inward, a roar of falling stone and white-hot energy that silenced the screaming of the swarm forever. When the dust finally settled cycles later, the Xylok had retreated from the sector, their spirit broken by a variable they couldn't calculate, the human heart. Lyra walked down into the ruins of the gorge alone. Her royal robes were stained with ash, her feet cutting on the sharp debris. She searched for hours until she found it, a small circular piece of metal glinting in the dirt. She picked up the old earth coin. It was scorched, the edges melted, but the image of the ancient eagle was still visible. She didn't cry. Instead, she stood in the center of that hollowed-out graveyard and looked toward the stars. The message had already gone out. The neighboring systems, inspired by the impossible stand of 44 ghosts, were finally mobilizing. A galactic alliance was forming, built not on trade agreements, but on the memory of a debt paid in full. In the center of the new capital, they didn't build a statue of a princess. They built a simple, rough-hewn stone wall that mirrored the width of the gorge. On it, they carved 44 names, and at the very top, embedded in the rock where everyone could touch it, was a single, tarnished coin. "Would you like me to generate an image of the towering monument built in the center of the new capital, featuring the stone wall and the embedded coin?"